a pack of cards thing, isn't it?
Is it like the top 10 list?
Sudan on there?
Oh, sorry. Do you know about the U.S. state-sponsored list of terrorism?
No.
No. I feel like I'm unaware. No.
I don't think I do.
If you were to guess what country would they
Yeah. 4 of them?
I'm like, I want to say the United States. We have our own, but
Yeah, but I imagine Iran.
yeah, actually.
Being at the top of the list.
I'm not sure what's on that.
Okay.
I've heard of it, but I don't know what countries are on it.
Okay.
I know it changes from time to time.
Yeah.
So.
Pakistan, Iraq, Iran.
I don't know where to start.
Iran and I don't know what else.
Possibly.
Washington.
Syria, Iran.
Maybe Russia?
Pakistan and Afghanistan.
No.
Sudan on there?
They keep up.
I don't know.
Mexico? Cuba?
Cuba is
Yeah, Cuba
the
is.
sponsor of terrorism.
Yes, I didn't know that any terrorists came from Cuba.
Cuba's a bit ridiculous, isn't it?
Do any of those surprise you?
Yeah.
Which one? Cuba? Why Cuba?
They don't hear about it much.
I think that's a very old prejudice.
I learned something.
According to the U.S. State Department website, Cuba has been designated as a state sponsor of terrorism since 1982. Although the government of Cuba has maintained a public stance against terrorism and terrorist financing in 2010, but there has been no evidence that it has severed ties with elements from the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also known as the FARC. Available information suggested that the Cuban government maintained limited contact with FARC members, but there was no evidence in direct financial or ongoing material support. And for these reasons, the U.S. State Department has designated Cuba on this list of U.S. state sponsors of terrorism.
Why then keep Cuba on the terrorism list? Cuba got on the state sponsor of terrorism list in 1982. It was put on at the time more as a political statement about Cuba than about the fact that they were supporting terrorists.
Well, sure. Cuba was put on the list during the Reagan administration, early in the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration came in with a sort of fairly confrontative, let's oppose the evil empire kind of agenda. And in that context, Cuba was put on the list, not because there was any particular evidence that Cuba was sponsoring terrorism then.
It's my understanding that Cuba was put on that list because it was exporting communist or socialist revolutions in Latin America.
So we didn't like that, or the Reagan administration didn't, and so we put Cuba on the terrorism list. We also were angry that Cuba had supported the M19 guerrillas in Colombia. Cuba gave them safe haven. Now, they did so at the request of the Colombian government in order to get the M19 guerrillas out of Colombia. It was a peace plan. It was a peace plan. But we charged Cuba with supporting terrorists by virtue of giving safe haven to the M19 guerrillas. Those aren't the same people as the FARC, who are in the guerrilla war now in Colombia. In fact, Cuba does not support the FARC.
The rationale for keeping Cuba, there wasn't much rationale in the first place. Whatever rationale there was disappeared a long time ago.
Sure, so for me, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have Cuba remain on the state-sponsored terrorist list, because for me it seems more like a political strategy or something that we're doing in line with the embargo that maybe at the time that they were instituted seemed to make sense to American policy and our own interests, but no longer seem to make sense.
I would note that Afghanistan, which harbored al-Qaeda, never made it to the list of countries that sponsored terrorism.
To the extent the terrorist list is useful, it ought to have countries that support terrorism on it, and Cuba isn't one of those countries.
So it's a list that's a little bit suspicious. We took Libya off the list. We took North Korea off the list. This is even when we thought they were actually still sponsoring terrorism around the world. But we were hoping to get something else. Well, it's hard to get Cuba off unless a president wants to get a country off. The president makes that designation. Congress has the possibility of reversing it, but typically Congress has not.
But to do so, they would have to put up with counter-pressure from hardliners in the Cuban American community, some people in both the House and the Senate, and from their point of view, I think the unfortunate truth is it's not worth the trouble. There are practical consequences to being on the list. So the U.S. has a broad embargo on Cuba, which I happen to think is wrong politically and morally. But apart from the trade embargo and the travel ban, being on the terrorist list has additional consequences.
That it gets in the way of our good relations with Latin America, because Latin America wants Cuba off that list. It gets in the way of good relations with Cuba, and it makes it very hard for the Cuban people, because it forces Cuba to deal with banking regulations that pertain to terrorist states, and they're not really a terrorist state. This raises the cost of their buying food and medicine, even when dealing with non-American banks.
It's got a series of implications for the Cuban economy that don't make any sense and are punitive to Cuba at a time when the country is involved in this process of economic reform, and we should be encouraging rather than complicating life for them.
Ultimately, it hurts the American people because Cuba has something to offer us. Cuba has had 50 years of terrorism that they've experienced against them. Sometimes we supported it, sometimes it was terrorism by exiles who had nothing to do with the United States. But they have suffered many, many people dying, sugar fields being blown up, factories being blown up, sabotage of equipment, food being poisoned, assassination attempts, you name it. They've experienced terrorism. And they have a very efficient way of trying to stop it and counter it. And we have something to learn from them in that process. But we can't do it because they're a terrorist state. We are, in effect, cutting off our own hands for some political reason that doesn't make any sense at all.
To me, this is just another roadblock towards reconciliation between the United States and Cuba, and as a Cuban American who would really like to see both countries move forward so that my generation won't be as separated from the people on the island as my grandparents' or parents' generation has been, I think that it's our best move to move Cuba off of the state-sponsored terrorist list.
Oh my God.